The first officer dropped at 4:47 a.m., his body folding silently into the mud before anyone heard the shot. The second fell 12 seconds later, clutching his throat as blood poured between his fingers. By the time the third man collapsed, the German command post erupted into chaos. But the sniper was already tracking his fourth target through a scope they'd laughed at just hours before. It was January 1945, and the Eastern Front had become a graveyard of frozen ambitions. The Red Army's Oder offensive was tearing through German defenses like a scythe through wheat, pushing toward Berlin with momentum that seemed unstoppable. In the small Polish town of Stanau under Oder, now known as Sinowa, a single German regiment was tasked with holding a critical river crossing long enough for retreating units to escape encirclement. It was a suicide mission dressed up as tactical delay. Everyone knew it. The question wasn't whether they would fall, but how long they could make the Soviets bleed for every meter. Among the defenders was a man named Klaus Becker, a 32-year-old sniper from Bavaria who had been fighting since the invasion of France in 1940. He was not a soldier shaped by propaganda or youthful fervor. He had been a forester before the war, a man who spent his days tracking deer through alpine fog and reading the subtle language of wind and shadow. When conscription came, his skills translated seamlessly into something darker. By 1945, he had over 90 confirmed kills, a number he no longer counted or spoke about. The war had stripped away any romance from the act. What remained was precision, routine, and a quiet resignation that this frozen riverbank would likely be his grave. Becker's equipment reflected the desperation of Germany's collapsing war machine. His rifle was a Karabiner 98K, a bolt-action weapon that had served the Wehrmacht since before the war began. It was reliable, accurate, and by 1945 standards, painfully obsolete compared to the semi-automatic rifles flooding into Soviet hands. But it was his scope that drew the most mockery from younger soldiers. It was a Zeiss Zielvier, a 4-power telescopic sight, made entirely of brass and glass. Designed in the 1930s, when the Reich still believed wars could be won with craftsmanship and tradition, the scope was heavy, prone to fogging in extreme cold, and lacked the modern coatings that prevented glare. Younger snipers with connections had upgraded to newer ZF-41 or ZF-42 scopes. Becker had been offered one twice. He refused both times. "This glass has kept me alive for 4 years," he told a skeptical lieutenant the night before the Soviet assault began. "I know its flaws. I know how it breathes in the cold. I trust it more than I trust anything else in this war." The lieutenant shrugged and walked away. Trust was a luxury in January 1945. Survival was math, and the numbers were all wrong. The Soviet plan was straightforward and brutal. A full rifle division, over 10,000 men, supported by T-34 tanks and Katyusha rocket artillery, would hammer the German positions at dawn, cross the Oder River, and continue westward without pause. Intelligence reported the German defenders numbered fewer than 800 men, most of them exhausted, poorly supplied, and demoralized. The assault was expected to take less than 3 hours. Soviet commanders scheduled their next briefing for noon, assuming they'd be 20 kilometers deeper into Germany by then. But wars are not won by assumptions. They are won by the men who see what others miss. Becker had spent the previous afternoon studying the terrain with the focus of a man preparing for his final exam. The Soviet staging area was visible from his position on the second floor of a half-collapsed mill overlooking the river. Through his Zeiss scope, he could see officers gathering around field tables, pointing at maps, issuing orders. He watched their routines, noted their ranks by insignia and behavior, identified who deferred to whom. He memorized faces. He calculated distances. He observed how the early morning mist clung to the low ground, how the wind shifted as the sun approached the horizon, how the frozen earth made certain approach routes louder than others. And he noticed something no one else had seen. The Soviet officers were gathering in the same location every morning just before dawn for final briefings. It was tactically sound, centralized command, clear communication, efficiency before an assault. But it was also a pattern, and patterns Becker knew were vulnerabilities. He did not sleep that night. Sleep was a risk he could not afford. Instead, he sat in the darkness of mill, his rifle resting across his knees, the Zeiss scope carefully wrapped in cloth to prevent condensation from forming on the lenses. He ate a piece of hard bread, drank melted snow from his canteen, and waited. Around him, the sound of preparation echoed through the frozen air. German soldiers digging deeper into their trenches, machine gunners checking belts, medics organizing supplies they knew would not be enough. No one spoke much. Words felt like wasted energy. At 4:30 a.m., the first hint of gray light touched the eastern horizon. Becker unwrapped his scope, wiped the lenses with a dry cloth, and moved into position. He wedged the rifle barrel through a gap in the shattered brick wall, adjusted his body until the weapon felt like an extension of the spine, and began his breathing exercises. Slow inhale, slower exhale, heart rate dropping, vision sharpening. Through the Zeiss glass, the Soviet command post came into focus. 6 officers stood around a folding table covered with maps. 2 more approached from the left. A staff car idled nearby, exhaust rising in white plumes. Becker estimated the range at 420 meters. Not an easy shot, but well within his capability. The morning mist was still thick, providing concealment. The wind was light, barely 2 kilometers per hour from the southwest. The cold had made the air dense, which meant bullets would fly truer but required a slight adjustment in elevation. He selected his first target carefully. A major, identifiable by the insignia on his collar and the way others leaned in to hear his words. A decision-maker, a man whose death would create confusion. Becker centered the crosshairs on the man's upper chest, exhaled halfway, and held. His finger rested on the trigger with the pressure of a feather. He did not think about the man's family. He did not think about morality or guilt. He thought about wind, distance, and a fraction of a second when his heartbeat would be still. He fired. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, the sound sharp and flat in the cold air. 420 meters away, the major's body jerked backward and collapsed. For 2 full seconds, no one moved. The Soviet officers froze, staring at the fallen man in confusion. They had not yet heard the shot. The distance in the mist delayed the sound, creating a surreal gap between cause and effect. Becker was already working the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a new round. He shifted aim to a captain standing near the table's edge. The man had just begun to turn, his mouth opening to shout a warning. Becker fired again. The captain's throat exploded in red mist. He dropped without a sound. Now the panic began. Officers scattered, some diving for cover behind the staff car, others sprinting toward the nearest trench. But Becker had anticipated this. He knew the terrain. He knew where they would run. His third shot caught a lieutenant mid-stride, the bullet entering through his back and exiting through his chest. The fourth shot killed a commissar who had thrown himself behind a crate, unaware that the angle of Becker's position gave him a clear line of sight. By now, Soviet soldiers were shouting, pointing in multiple directions, firing blindly into the mist. Machine guns opened up, raking the tree line 300 meters south of Becker's actual position. Mortars began to fall, but they were targeting the wrong grid. Becker remained still, his position undetected, his breathing calm. He had become a ghost wrapped in brick and shadow. The 5th target was a colonel, identifiable by his long coat and the way he barked orders even while crouching. Becker placed the crosshairs on the man's head and fired. The colonel's body went limp instantly. The 6th was a young lieutenant who made the fatal mistake of standing to rally his men. Becker's bullet found his heart. 7 minutes had passed since the first shot. 6 Soviet officers were dead. The command post had dissolved into chaos. Men were running, dragging bodies, screaming for medics. The planned dawn assault had not yet begun, but the leadership structure was already fracturing. Becker paused. He wiped his scope lenses again, checked his ammunition. He had 11 rounds left in his pouch. The Soviets were beginning to regroup, pulling back to secondary positions. He could see new officers arriving, trying to restore order. He selected his 7th target, a captain holding a radio handset, likely calling for artillery support. The bullets silenced in mid-transmission. The 8th was a major who had taken command and was gesturing toward Becker's general area. The man had guessed a direction, but not the exact position. Becker fired before the major could issue the order. The 9th target was a commissar trying to push men forward into the assault. He fell face first into the frozen mud. By now, the Soviet command was in full disarray. The attack, scheduled to begin at 5 a.m., had been delayed. Officers were dead or hiding. Communication had broken down. Soldiers who moments before had been preparing for a coordinated offensive were now hunkered in trenches, terrified of an enemy they could not see. Becker fired his 10th shot at a lieutenant colonel, who emerged from a bunker to assess the situation. The man died before he took 3 steps. The 11th shot killed a senior sergeant who had been designated as temporary field commander. When the sergeant collapsed, the remaining Soviet personnel abandoned the command post entirely, retreating 200 meters to a secondary position beyond Becker's effective range. It was 5:23 a.m. In 36 minutes, Klaus Becker had killed 11 Soviet officers with 11 shots from a scope they called outdated. The dawn assault that was supposed to sweep through German defenses in 3 hours never began on schedule. Confused, leaderless, and demoralized, the Soviet division delayed its attack for over 4 hours, while new command staff were brought forward and the situation assessed. Those 4 hours saved the German regiment. Reinforcements arrived. Defensive positions were strengthened. When the Soviet assault finally came, it met organized resistance instead of a panic collapse. The crossing was held for 2 additional days, allowing thousands of German soldiers and civilians to escape westward. Becker did not celebrate. When the Soviet artillery finally bracketed his position an hour later, he slipped out through a drainage tunnel beneath the mill and moved to a fallback position 300 meters north. He cleaned his rifle, wrapped his scope, and prepared for the next engagement. He survived the Battle of Stanau. He survived the war. He returned to Bavaria, became a forester again, and never spoke publicly about what he'd done. But the men who fought alongside him that day told the story. They told it in field hospitals, in prisoner camps, in quiet conversations decades later. They told it because it defied expectation. Because in a war defined by mechanized destruction and overwhelming force, one man with an old rifle and a glass scope had reminded them that skill, patience, and knowledge still mattered. The Zeiss Zielvier scope Becker used was never upgraded, never replaced. After the war, he kept it in a wooden box in his attic. When asked why, he said simply, because it saw clearly when everything else was chaos. There is a lesson woven into this story that transcends tactics and history. In a world obsessed with the newest tools, the latest technology, and the belief that progress is always measured in upgrades, Klaus Becker proved that mastery is not about having the best equipment. It is about knowing your equipment so intimately that it becomes invisible, an extension of your will rather than a tool you operate. The younger snipers mocked his old scope because they measured value by specifications. Becker measured value by results. This principle extends far beyond battlefields. In every field, in every discipline, the modern world pushes the myth that better tools equal better outcomes. We are told to upgrade, to replace, to adopt the new, and sometimes that is true. But more often, real excellence comes from depth, not breadth, from mastery, not novelty. Becker did not win that battle because his scope was superior. He won because he understood its limitations and worked within them so skillfully that they ceased to be limitations at all. He won because he studied the terrain while others rested. He won because he observed patterns while others assumed chaos. He won because he controlled his breathing, his heartbeat, his fear, turning his body into a platform of absolute stability. He won because he made decisions based on knowledge, not hope. And perhaps most importantly, he won because he did not mistake confidence for arrogance. He did not underestimate his enemy. He did not assume that superior numbers or better planning would guarantee Soviet success. He found a single point where skill could overcome force, where patience could defeat momentum, and he executed with absolute precision. The Soviet officers who died that morning were not incompetent. They were following sound doctrine, preparing a well-organized assault, doing everything their training had taught them. But they made one critical error. They assumed that patterns visible to them were invisible to their enemy. They assumed that distance and miss provided safety. They assumed that an outdated scope in the hands of a single soldier could not alter the course of a division-level offensive. They assumed wrong. War is often described as chaos, but those who survive it know the truth. War is chaos punctuated by moments of absolute clarity, Moments when a single decision, a single action, a single shot changes everything. Klaus Becker found one of those moments. He did not create it. He recognized it. And when the moment came, he was ready. That readiness was not luck. It was a product of years of experience, hours of observation, and a refusal to let the opinions of others dictate his choices. When younger soldiers mocked his scope, he did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply continued to trust what he knew to be true. That quiet confidence, born from competence, is rarer than courage, and it is far more dangerous to an enemy. The story of Klaus Becker and his impossible morning is not a call to reject progress or cling to outdated tools for sentiment's sake. It is a reminder that tools are only as effective as the person wielding them. A master with a simple instrument will always outperform a novice with the best technology. The weapon does not win the fight. The mind behind the weapon does. In the decades since that frozen January dawn, the world has changed in ways Becker could never have imagined. Technology has advanced beyond recognition. Modern snipers carry scopes with rangefinders, ballistic computers, and thermal imaging. And yet, the fundamental principles Becker demonstrated remain unchanged. See clearly. Know your environment. Control yourself. Execute with precision. These are not outdated concepts. They are timeless. The 11 officers who fell before dawn did not die because of scope. They died because a forester from Bavaria, a man who once tracked deer through mountain fog, applied the same patience and discipline to a different kind of hunt. They died because Klaus Becker refused to let the chaos of war dictate his actions. Instead, he created a small island of absolute control in a sea of destruction. And for 36 minutes, that was enough to change the outcome of a battle. This is the paradox of skill at the highest level. It often appears effortless, even invisible. Those who watched Becker's impact saw only the results: dead officers, delayed assault, confusion. They did not see the hours of preparation, the years of experience, the internal discipline that made those shots possible. Excellence hides its effort. It looks simple from the outside, which is why it is so often underestimated. The Zeiss Zilvier scope sits in a museum now, donated by Becker's family after his death in 1987. The brass is tarnished, the glass shows scratches from decades of use, and the leather strap is cracked and faded. Visitors walk past it without a second glance, drawn instead to the more impressive displays of modern weaponry. But those who know the story stop. They lean close. They study the old glass and wonder what it saw through the mist that January morning. It saw what it had always seen, clearly, steadily, without illusion or distortion, just like the man who looked through it. So here's the question this story leaves us with, a question that applies to soldiers and civilians alike, to anyone who has ever been told their tools are outdated, their methods old-fashioned, their approach obsolete. Do you trust the newest thing, or do you trust what you know works? Do you chase upgrades, or do you pursue mastery? Do you measure yourself by what you have, or by what you can do? Klaus Becker answered that question 11 times before dawn, and in doing so, he reminded the world that wars are not won by the side with the best equipment. They are won by the side with the best soldiers. And the best soldiers are not those with the most advanced tools. They are those who have turned their tools, whatever they may be, into extensions of their will. The dawn came slowly that morning, filtering through mist and smoke, revealing a battlefield that had not unfolded as planned. The Soviet division, so confident just hours before, sat paralyzed and leaderless. The German regiment, outnumbered and doomed, had been given a reprieve, and somewhere in the ruins of a frozen mill, a man with an old scope and steady hands packed his rifle and moved on to the next position. He did not think of himself as a hero. He did not think of himself as exceptional. He simply did what he had trained to do, with the tools he had learned to trust, in the manner that experience had taught him, and that, more than any scope or rifle or strategy, is the real lesson. Mastery is not about having the best. It is about being the best with what you have. The minutes following Becker's 11th shot unfolded in a silence that felt heavier than the artillery barges that would come later. Soviet troops, huddled in their staging trenches, whispered each other in confusion and fear. Their officers were gone, not wounded, not captured, but systematically eliminated by an enemy they could not locate in the rigid hierarchy of the Red Army, where orders flowed downward with absolute clarity. The sudden decapitation command created a paralysis that no amount of courage or numbers could immediately overcome. Junior officers and senior sergeants found themselves thrust into decisions they were not trained to make. Soviet military doctrine in 1945 was brutally effective but also inflexible. It relied on clear chains of command, predetermined plans, and overwhelming force applied according to precise timetables. Initiative at lower levels was discouraged. Improvisation was often seen as a sign of poor planning. When the timetable collapsed and the planners were dead, the machine simply stopped. This was Becker's true genius. Not just the shots themselves, but the understanding of what those shots would create. He had not merely killed 11 men. He had severed the nervous system of an entire offensive operation. Every death created a cascading effect. Delays in communication, confusion about objectives, hesitation among subordinates, and ultimately, a psychological wound that cut deeper than any bullet. In the German trenches, the reaction was equally profound but entirely different. Soldiers who had been preparing for their final stand, who had written last letters and made peace with their fate, suddenly felt a flicker of something they thought had been extinguished: hope. Word spread quickly through the defensive line. A sniper, someone said, "One of ours. He's killing their officers." The assault is delayed. Hope is a dangerous emotion in warfare. It can lead to recklessness, to assumptions that survival is possible when logic says otherwise. But in that moment, hope was also fuel. It steadied hands. It sharpened focus. It reminded exhausted men that their enemy, despite all advantages, was not invincible, and that psychological shift, however small, mattered. The German regimental commander, a grizzled colonel named Wilhelm Strauss, received the initial reports with skepticism. 11 officers dead from a single sniper? It seemed too precise to be real, the kind of story men tell themselves to mask the randomness of artillery or the chaos of chance. But when Soviet radio intercepts confirmed confusion, when the dawn assault failed to materialize at 5 a.m. as scheduled, Strauss allowed himself a rare smile. He did not know Klaus Becker personally. He had seen the man's name on rosters, noted his kill count in reports, but they had never spoken. Becker was not the type of soldier who sought recognition or developed relationships with command staff. He was a loner by nature and necessity. Snipers operated best on the edges of units, moving independently, making decisions without waiting for approval. They were trusted because they delivered results, not because they attended briefings or saluted properly. But Strauss understood what Becker had done. He understood that those 4 hours of delay were not just time. They were an opportunity. He immediately ordered engineers to reinforce critical positions, redistributed ammunition to sectors most likely to face the delayed assault, and sent runners to contact neighboring units to coordinate a more robust defense. What should have been a panic scramble to hold for a few hours became a calculated effort to make the Soviets pay dearly for every meter. When the Soviet assault finally came, at 9:37 a.m., it was disorganized and tentative. New officers, brought forward from reserve units, did not know the terrain. They did not know which approach routes had been scouted, which strong points had been identified, which tactics the fallen officers had planned to employ. They improvised, and improvisation in the face of a dug-in enemy rarely ends well. The battle that followed was brutal and costly for both sides. Soviet infantry, supported by T-34 tanks and heavy artillery, eventually overwhelmed sections of the German line through sheer attrition. But the 2 extra days of Becker's action had helped secure allowed thousands of soldiers and civilians to retreat westward across the Oder River, escaping encirclement and capture. Those 2 days saved lives that would have been lost. They preserved units that would fight again. They delayed, even if only slightly, the Red Army's advance toward Berlin. And Klaus Becker, the man who had made it possible, moved through the battle like a shadow. He relocated 3 more times that day, firing opportunistically at targets of value: machine gunners, mortar teams, radio operators. He did not keep count. By that point in the war, numbers had lost all meaning. He simply did his job stayed alive, and moved when staying became too dangerous. In the decades after the war, military historians studying the Vistula-Oder offensive occasionally came across references to the Stay Now action. Most dismissed it as a minor skirmish, statistically irrelevant in the context of a campaign involving millions of men across hundreds of kilometers. A few noted the unusual delay in the Soviet assault, but attributed it to logistical issues or communication breakdowns, common enough in the chaos of rapid offensive operations. Only a handful of researchers, those who dug into Soviet after-action reports and interviewed surviving German veterans, pieced together the truth. And even then, the story seemed almost mythical. One sniper, 11 officers, 4-hour delay, battle outcome altered. It read like propaganda, the kind of tale armies tell to boost morale. Except it was real. The names of the dead Soviet officers were documented. The German defensive success was recorded. The timeline matched. What made the story difficult for modern analysts to accept was how deeply it contradicted the dominant narrative of the Eastern Front's final year. By 1945, the war had become industrialized slaughter on an unimaginable scale. Individual action seemed dwarfed by the sheer mass of men, tanks, and artillery. The idea that one skilled soldier with an old rifle could meaningfully impact a division-level operation felt anachronistic, like claiming a single sword could turn the tide of naval battle. But that is precisely what makes Becker's story so important. It is a reminder that even in the most mechanized, most overwhelming, most modern of conflicts, human skill and human decision-making remain the ultimate variables. Technology amplifies capability, but it does not replace competence. Numbers create pressure, but they do not guarantee victory. The soldier who sees what others miss, who acts when others hesitate, who masters his tools and his fear, that soldier can still change the outcome. This truth has been demonstrated countless times throughout history, though it is often forgotten in peacetime, when theories replace experience and equipment catalogs replace training manuals. The longbowmen at Agincourt, the Spartans at Thermopylae, the Finnish snipers during the Winter War. These are not just stories of courage. They are stories of skill applied at the precise moment when skill matters most. Klaus Becker understood this intuitively. He never read military philosophy. He never attended advanced tactical schools. His education came from the forest, from years of learning to read the wind, to control his breathing, to wait with absolute patience for the moment when movement and stillness aligned. When the war took those skills and turned them toward darker purposes, he adapted. He did not question or philosophize. He survived. After the war, Becker returned to the Bavarian forest he had left in 1940. He worked as a forester, lived in a small cabin, and spoke rarely about his experiences. When younger men, veterans of later conflicts or students of military history, sought him out for interviews, he was polite but evasive. He would confirm basic facts. Yes, he had been a sniper. Yes, he had fought on the Eastern Front. Yes, he had used a Zeiss scope throughout the war, but he refused to glorify or dramatize. He did not keep records. He did not collect medals. He simply lived. Those who knew him described a man of profound quietness, someone comfortable with silence and solitude. He married late, had no children, and seemed most at ease when walking alone through mountains, watching the same deer his ancestors had hunted for generations. If the war had left scars, he did not display them publicly, but those close to him noticed certain things. How he always positioned himself with his back to a wall, how he studied faces in crowds, how sudden loud noises would cause a brief but unmistakable stillness, as if he were calculating distance and threat. The Zeiss scope remained in his possession until his death. He cleaned it regularly, though he never used it again. When his wife asked why he kept it, he said only, "It is the one thing that never lied to me." She did not press further. Some questions, she understood, carried answers too heavy to speak. So where does this leave us, those of us who live in a world so far removed from frozen riverbanks and desperate last stands? What relevance does Klaus Becker's story hold for people who will never hold a rifle, never face an enemy, never make life or death decisions in the span of a heartbeat? The answer lies not in the specifics of his actions, but in the principles that guided them. Becker succeeded because he mastered fundamentals. He succeeded because he refused to let the opinions of others dictate his choices. He succeeded because he prepared when preparation seemed pointless, studied when study seemed excessive, and trusted his experience when trust was all he had left. These are not military principles. They are human principles. They apply to anyone who has ever been told they're using outdated methods. Anyone who has ever felt pressure to abandon what works in favor of what is new. Anyone who has ever had to perform under conditions where failure means catastrophe. The world will always push for upgrades. It will always offer newer, faster, better. And sometimes those improvements are real and necessary. But the lesson of Klaus Becker is this: never confuse a tool with a skill. Never assume that having the latest equipment makes you competent. And never underestimate the power of deep, practiced mastery over shallow, trending novelty. Becker's scope was outdated by 1945 standards, but his understanding of ballistics, his knowledge of environmental factors, his control over his body and mind, these were not outdated. They were timeless. And when the moment came that required all of those elements to align perfectly, he was ready, not because of his scope, because of who he had become through years of disciplined practice. This is the final, most enduring lesson. Excellence is not a destination. It is a process. It is the accumulation of thousands of small decisions, small practices, small commitments that no one sees and no one applauds. It is a choice to clean your scope when you are exhausted, to study the terrain when you could be resting, to fire one more practice round when your hands are numb with cold. And then, if you are lucky and circumstances align, all of those invisible efforts converge into a single visible moment. A moment when 11 officers fall before dawn. A moment when an impossible shot becomes routine. A moment when the outdated becomes legendary. Klaus Becker did not set out to become a legend. He set out to survive. And in doing so, he reminded the world that survival at the highest level is not about luck or equipment. It is about mastery. And mastery, once achieved, never goes out of style. Subscribe now if you want to hear more stories of impossible moments that changed history. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Thanks for being here.